Across ridges and timberlands, travelers describe nights when the wilderness seems aware, shapes between trees, heavy steps out of sight, campsites disturbed. Even hikers sense an intelligence watching from the tree line. From a late-season aurora train in Alaska, jolted by something pacing the roof, to a black forest ridge in Germany, where a botanist's camp sits empty amid huge tracks, the pattern grows hard to ignore. In this video, we'll uncover 6 chilling encounters with something that walks the woods unseen. The Aurora Tour train had been operating along the rugged Alaskan interior since the late 1980s, when enterprising locals realized that late autumn provided some of the most spectacular light displays in the Northern Hemisphere. The route wound through dense spruce forests and across frozen tundra, offering passengers panoramic views of wilderness that remained largely untouched by human development. By November, the tour season was nearly finished, with only the most dedicated enthusiasts willing to brave the dropping temperatures for a glimpse of the celestial phenomenon. The railway itself followed an old mining track, abandoned in the 1950s and refurbished decades later, cutting through terrain so remote that cell service remained a fantasy, and the nearest town sat 40 miles south. On the evening of November 5th, 2025, the train carried fewer than 20 passengers, a skeleton crew compared to the packed cars of September and October. The atmosphere inside was subdued but pleasant, with travelers bundled in heavy coats and thermal blankets, nursing thermoses of coffee while waiting for darkness to deepen enough for the lights to appear. Wildlife guide Lena Moritz sat near the rear car, scanning the tree line with practiced eyes, noting the absence of the usual animal activity. She had worked these tours for 7 years and prided herself on spotting moose, caribou, and the occasional wolf for passengers to photograph. But that evening, something felt distinctly wrong. The forest, normally alive with subtle movement and sound, had gone completely still. Lena mentioned this to the couple seated across from her, but they attributed it to the cold. She was about to dismiss her own unease when the rear car suddenly lurched violently, as though something massive had collided with it from the outside. Windows rattled in their frames, and several passengers yelped in surprise. The conductor's voice crackled over the intercom, assuring everyone that they had likely crossed over a section of track affected by shifting permafrost, a common enough occurrence this time of year. The explanation seemed reasonable, and the nervous chatter gradually subsided. Then the footsteps began. Heavy, deliberate thuds echoed from the roof of the rear car, each one spaced several seconds apart. Passengers fell silent, heads tilted upward, listening. The footsteps moved slowly and methodically, progressing from the back toward the front of the train. Lena felt her stomach tighten as the sounds passed directly overhead, pausing for a long moment before continuing. The weight distribution was all wrong. Whatever was up there was far heavier than any person, and the spacing suggested something with an impossibly long stride. Retired brakeman Samuel Hodge, who had worked the railway before his knees forced him into retirement, sat near the front of the rear car. He pressed his face against the cold glass, squinting into the darkness beyond the train's exterior lights. What he saw made his breath catch. A figure stood at the edge of the tree line, tall and unnervingly straight, its silhouette lacking the natural articulation of joints that defined human posture. It was massive, easily 7 or 8 feet in height, and appeared to be watching the train with a stillness that suggested patience rather than curiosity. Samuel called out to the conductor, but his voice was drowned by a new sound, a long, scraping noise that dragged across the metal roof, moving steadily toward the engine. It sounded like something testing the structural integrity of the train itself. probing for weakness. The scraping continued for nearly a minute before stopping abruptly. The train rolled on through the darkness, and gradually, passengers began to convince themselves that the entire episode had been some strange acoustic trick of the wind or a falling branch. When the train finally stopped at a designated viewing point 20 minutes later, the conductor and crew disembarked to perform a routine inspection. What they found silenced the easy explanations. Massive footprints, far larger than any bear or moose could produce, were pressed deep into the snow and frozen earth beside the tracks. The prints were spaced impossibly far apart, suggesting a creature with a stride length that defied reasonable biology. Most disturbing was their pattern. They approached the tracks from the forest, followed alongside the train for nearly a quarter mile, then veered back into the trees. Inside the rear car, crew members discovered something that defied explanation. Several of the bolted passenger seats had been twisted out of alignment, their metal frames bent into a spiral pattern that pointed directly toward the woods. The damage was fresh, the metal still showing stress marks, and no amount of track shifting or mechanical failure could account for the specific directionality of the warping. The conductor radioed the incident to the main office, describing the footprints and damage in careful, measured terms. The response was predictable. Officials suggested a combination of wildlife activity and structural stress from temperature fluctuations. No formal investigation was launched, and passengers were offered vouchers for future tours, along with polite requests to avoid speculation on social media. But among those who had been aboard that night, a different narrative took hold. Lena Moritz, who had seen countless animals in her years as a guide, stated flatly that whatever had been on that train was neither bear nor moose. Samuel Hodge, despite his age and declining health, insisted with absolute certainty that the figure he had seen at the tree line possessed an awareness that separated it from ordinary wildlife. Most unsettling was the timeline itself. The footprints suggested that whatever had made them had not chased or followed the train in reaction to its presence. The spacing and positioning indicated something far more deliberate. The creature had been waiting along that particular stretch of track, positioned precisely where the train would pass, as though it had known the route and schedule. The attack, if it could be called that, had not been opportunistic, it had been planned. The tour company continued operations, though the November 5th incident was quietly scrubbed from official records. Lena Moritz transferred to summer tours in less remote areas. Samuel Hodge stopped taking the train altogether, and late-season passengers occasionally reported odd sounds from the roof or glimpses of something large moving parallel to the tracks, just beyond the reach of the exterior lights, keeping pace with mechanical precision through the Alaskan wilderness. The backcountry wilderness of northern Minnesota had attracted campers and hikers since the logging boom of the early 20th century, when crude trails were first cut through dense forests of pine and birch. By the 1970s, most of the commercial logging had ceased, leaving behind a patchwork of second-growth woodland interspersed with older stands that had somehow escaped the saw. The area remained popular with experienced outdoors enthusiasts who appreciated the isolation and the challenge of navigating terrain where marked trails grew scarce and cell phone coverage was non-existent. Local rangers occasionally warned visitors about black bears and the rare timber wolf, but the wilderness was generally considered safe for those who respected its boundaries. On October 16, 2024, three friends, Adrian Strom, Mara Bhattacharya, and Louis Folsom, drove north from Minneapolis with camping gear and plans to spend 4 days exploring a particularly remote section of forest they had identified using topographical maps. They were all in their late 20s, reasonably experienced campers, and eager for a trip that would take them far from the noise of civilization. The hollow they selected for their base camp appeared perfect, a natural clearing surrounded by unusually uniform trees, with a small creek running along one edge and enough flat ground for their tents. The first night passed uneventfully, though Lewis mentioned hearing odd clicking sounds whenever he wandered beyond the firelight to relieve himself or gather more wood. He described it as rhythmic but irregular, like stones being knocked together at varying intervals. Adrian and Mara heard nothing unusual and suggested he was probably hearing branches settling in the cold, or perhaps a porcupine moving through the underbrush. Lewis accepted this explanation, but remained slightly uneasy. The second night brought a change. Around 2 in the morning, all three were awakened by clicking sounds that circled their tents in slow, deliberate loops. The noise was too loud and too purposeful to dismiss as natural forest sounds. Adrian unzipped his tent and shone his flashlight into the darkness, but the beam revealed nothing except trees and shadows. The clicking continued for nearly 20 minutes before gradually fading into silence. None of them slept well for the remainder of the night. Just before dawn, Mara awoke to hear her name being called from somewhere outside the tents. The voice was faint, almost a whisper, and she initially assumed Lewis was trying to get her attention for some reason. She pulled on her boots and stepped outside, expecting to find him near the cold fire pit. Instead, she found the campsite empty except for Adrian, who was still asleep in his tent. What she did find was a line of enormous footprints pressed deep into the soft earth near the tree line, each one significantly larger than any human foot and spaced far apart. The prints led directly into the dense brush. Mara's shout woke Adrian, and together they began searching for Lewis. They found him minutes later in the exact center of the hollow, lying on his back with his eyes open and staring upward. He was unresponsive, but breathing, his body completely unharmed except for one bizarre detail. Someone or something had arranged freshly torn branches in a perfect circle around him, each one roughly the same length and positioned with obvious deliberation. There were no footprints leading to or from his location, aside from the ones Mara and Adrian had just made. They managed to rouse Lewis after several minutes of shaking him and calling his name. He had no memory of leaving his tent or of anything that had happened after he fell asleep. He complained of feeling disoriented and cold, but insisted he was not injured. Adrian immediately advocated for leaving, and Mara agreed. As they hurriedly packed their gear, both noticed fresh footprints circling all three tents, pressed into areas that had been undisturbed the previous evening. These new prints were closer than the ones near the tree line, some stopping just inches from tent walls. The forest, which had been filled with bird song and the rustle of small animals during the previous mornings, was now completely silent. Even the creek seemed muted, as though the water itself was moving more quietly. The three loaded their packs and began hiking toward the trailhead at a pace just short of running. The clicking followed them for the first 2 miles, staying just out of sight but maintaining a consistent distance. Then, as they reached the marked trail that led back to the parking area, it stopped abruptly. The silence that replaced it felt final, almost satisfied, as though whatever had been following them had escorted them to the boundary and was now content to let them leave. The Ontario backcountry had been shaped by glacial retreat thousands of years ago, leaving behind a landscape of rocky outcrops, deep lakes, and forests so dense that sunlight barely reached the ground in places. The region had seen waves of settlement over the centuries, first indigenous peoples, then French trappers, followed by British logging operations in the 19th century. By the late 20th century, most commercial activity had ceased, and the wilderness returned to something close to its original state. Modern campers ventured into these areas for the solitude and the opportunity to experience nature largely unmediated by human infrastructure. The nearest town sat nearly 60 miles south, connected by a single unpaved logging road that became impassable during heavy rains. On November 14, 2025, siblings Marissa and Cole Jensen drove north from Toronto with plans to spend a long weekend camping in a remote section of forest they had researched online. Both were in their early 30s, experienced enough to handle wilderness camping, but not so jaded that they had lost their enthusiasm for it. They chose a spot several miles from any established trail, accessible only by bushwhacking through dense undergrowth and across two shallow creeks. The location seemed ideal, a small clearing surrounded by old-growth pines, with enough space for their tent and a proper fire ring. The first night passed pleasantly, with clear skies and temperatures that dropped just enough to make the fire welcome without being uncomfortable. They hung their battery-powered lantern from a tree branch about 7 feet off the ground, positioning it to illuminate the campsite without being too bright. When they woke the next morning, however, the lantern was hanging from a different tree entirely, at a height of at least 12 feet. Neither could explain how it had been moved, and each accused the other of playing a prank. The argument was good-natured, but left both feeling slightly unsettled. That evening, they deliberately placed the lantern on a flat rock near the fire pit, agreeing to leave it there overnight to settle the question of who was responsible for the previous night's incident. They went to sleep with the mystery unresolved. When Cole woke just after dawn and stepped outside, he found their entire cooking station, portable stove, utensils, pots, and food containers, arranged in a perfect circle about 15 feet from where they had left it the previous evening. Each item was positioned with obvious care, and surrounding the circle were massive footprints pressed deep into the soft soil. The prints were far too large to be human, with a stride length that suggested something exceptionally tall. Marissa emerged from the tent and stared at the scene in silence. Neither spoke for several moments. Cole suggested they pack up and leave, but Marissa argued that they had paid for 3 nights and that whatever was happening was probably just local wildlife being curious. They spent the day hiking and trying to convince themselves that the footprints belonged to a bear, though the shape and spacing made this explanation feel inadequate. After dark, they retreated to their truck rather than the tent, locking the doors and keeping the windows closed despite the stuffy air. Around midnight, something began pacing the tree line just beyond the reach of their headlight. They could hear it clearly, heavy footsteps moving deliberately through the underbrush, accompanied by sharp inhalations, as though whatever was out there was scenting the air. Then came the whistles, low, guttural sound that seemed to originate from multiple locations simultaneously, as though coordinated by something with intelligence. The whistling continued intermittently for nearly 2 hours before finally ceasing. Neither Marissa nor Cole slept. When the first light of dawn began filtering through the trees, they cautiously exited the truck to find the lantern completely gone. A trail of broken branches led downhill into a narrow valley they had not yet explored. Each branch snapped at roughly the same height and positioned to form an obvious path. Cole followed the trail for about 50 yards, moving slowly and stopping frequently to listen. The footprints reappeared here, pressed into patches of exposed earth between the trees. They were extraordinarily large, with clear toe impressions that ruled out any conventional animal. More disturbing was the stride length. The distance between prints suggested something capable of covering ground with far fewer steps than any human could manage. The prints led deeper into the valley, where the forest grew darker and the undergrowth thicker. Cole returned to the campsite and found Marissa already loading gear into the truck. Neither needed to discuss their decision. They abandoned several items, a cooler, some firewood, and a folding chair, in their haste to leave. As they drove down the rough, logging road toward civilization, both felt a persistent sensation of being watched, as though something was tracking their departure from a position deeper in the forest. The lantern was never recovered. In the weeks that followed, Marissa found herself unable to shake the conviction that it had not simply been taken as a curious animal might steal a shiny object. The deliberate arrangement of their belongings, the calculated pacing at night, and the trail of broken branches all suggested intent. Something in that forest had claimed the lantern, and the message was clear. They had been camping in territory that belonged to something else. The northern Canadian wilderness stretched for hundreds of miles without significant human presence. A vast expanse of boreal forest, broken only by rivers, lakes, and occasional clearings where fire or disease had temporarily claimed the trees. The region had been inhabited by indigenous peoples for thousands of years, their traditional territories covering areas that modern maps designated simply as remote or uninhabited. By the 20th century, most non-indigenous activity consisted of seasonal hunting, occasional resource surveys, and the rare adventurer seeking solitude far from civilization. The nearest permanent settlement lay over 80 miles to the south, connected to the outside world by a single gravel road that closed during winter. Cell phone towers were non-existent, and satellite phones remained the only reliable means of communication. On July 15, 2023, a hiker named Jared Collins drove north from Edmonton with plans to spend 10 days exploring an area he had identified using satellite imagery and old forestry maps. He was 34 years old, an experienced outdoorsman who had completed solo trips in various remote locations across Western Canada. He had informed a friend of his general route and agreed to radio in every evening using a handheld CB radio he had purchased specifically for the trip. Jared was meticulous about safety protocols, carrying more than enough food, a water filtration system, and emergency supplies that included a flare gun and first aid kit. The first 3 days proceeded according to plan. Jared radioed his friend each evening, describing the terrain and wildlife he had encountered. On the 4th day, however, his evening transmission carried a different tone. He reported that the forest seemed wrong, using that exact word repeatedly. He said it felt like the trees were shifting around him, that trails he had marked earlier in the day appeared to have moved or disappeared entirely. His friend asked if he was feeling ill or disoriented, suggesting that dehydration or altitude might be affecting his perception. Jared insisted he felt fine physically, but that something about the forest had changed. The transmission ended with Jared promising to radio again the following evening. That transmission never came. When his friend heard nothing by the next morning, he waited several more hours before contacting local authorities. A small search party was organized and departed the following day, using the coordinates Jared had provided during his last radio contact. The terrain was difficult, requiring the searchers to proceed on foot through dense forest and across areas where fallen trees and thick undergrowth slowed progress to a crawl. They reached Jared's campsite late on the 2nd day of searching. What they found defied easy explanation. The campsite was completely intact. His tent remained pitched and properly staked. The entrance zipped shut from the inside. His backpack sat beside the cold fire pit, every pocket still fastened. Food containers were sealed and stacked neatly near the tent. Nothing appeared disturbed or out of place, except for the arrangement of certain items around the perimeter of the camp. Sticks had been driven into the ground at regular intervals, forming lines that pointed directly toward the dense forest to the north. The sticks were all approximately the same length and positioned with obvious deliberation. Near the tent, someone had stacked small stones into crude towers, each one balanced carefully and standing about a foot high. The searchers counted 7 of these stone stacks, each positioned at what seemed to be a measured distance from the tent. The ground around the campsite bore enormous footprints, far larger than any human boot, and shaped in a way that suggested bare feet with clearly articulated toes. The prints were spaced impossibly far apart, some measuring 6 feet from heel to heel. More disturbing was the pattern they created. Several sets of prints intersected at odd angles, as though whatever had made them could step sideways without turning its body. Some prints appeared to overlap in ways that violated basic physics, suggesting movement that defied conventional bipedal locomotion. Broken branches hung throughout the area surrounding the camp. Some snapped cleanly, while others appeared to have been twisted until the wood splintered. Several branches had been tied together using what looked like plant fibers, forming crude symbols that meant nothing to the searchers, but clearly represented intentional construction. The forest itself felt oppressive and silent. No birds called, no insects hummed, and even the wind seemed absent. Yet periodically, faint snapping sounds echoed from different directions, as though something large was moving through the underbrush just out of sight. The search party spent 3 days combing the surrounding area in expanding circles from the campsite. They found no trace of Jared Collins. His radio was discovered inside his tent, turned off and showing a full battery. His boots remained inside his sleeping bag, suggesting he had either left the tent barefoot or had been wearing different footwear. No blood, no signs of struggle, no indication of where he might have gone. The official report classified the incident as a missing person case with undetermined circumstances. The searchers privately admitted to feeling watched throughout their time at the campsite, as though the forest itself was aware of their presence and was waiting for them to leave. One member of the search party reported hearing footsteps circling their own camp on the final night, heavy and deliberate, but found nothing when he investigated with a flashlight. Jared Collins was never found, and the forest kept whatever secrets it held. The boreal forests of northern Minnesota had supported logging operations since the mid-19th century, when vast stands of white pine drew timber companies northward in search of resources to fuel the nation's westward expansion. By the early 20th century, most of the virgin timber had been harvested, but second-growth forests eventually matured enough to support smaller, more selective logging operations. These modern enterprises focused on sustainable harvest, taking individual trees rather than clear-cutting entire sections. The work remained physically demanding and isolated, with logging crews often working miles from the nearest paved road. The forests themselves were dense and disorienting, with terrain that varied from flat lowlands to rocky ridges, all covered by a thick canopy that blocked sunlight and made navigation challenging even for experienced woodsmen. On August 18, 2017, a lumberjack named Eli Ward was assigned to survey and mark trees along an overgrown service trail that wound through a particularly remote section of forest. He was 42 years old and had worked in logging for nearly 2 decades, spending most of that time in the northern Minnesota wilderness. His supervisor considered him reliable and competent, the kind of worker who could be trusted to complete assignments without constant oversight. Eli's task that day was straightforward: hike approximately 4 miles along the service trail, identify mature trees suitable for harvest, and mark them with spray paint for a cutting crew that would follow later in the week. He left the main logging camp around 7 in the morning, carrying a day pack with water, lunch, spray paint canisters, and a handheld GPS unit. He radioed the camp supervisor around noon to report that he had marked roughly half the designated area and expected to finish by mid-afternoon. That was the last communication anyone had with him. When Eli failed to return by nightfall, the supervisor organized a small search party that departed at first light the following morning. They followed the service trail on foot, calling Eli's name periodically and watching for any signs of disturbance. The trail itself was barely maintained, overgrown with brush in places and crossed by fallen logs that had to be climbed over or skirted around. About 3.5 miles from the main camp, they reached a small clearing where the forest opened up enough to allow sunlight to reach the ground. What they found there stopped them immediately. Eli Ward lay motionless in the center of the clearing, positioned on his back with his arms at his sides. His boots had been removed and placed beside him, crossed at the ankles in a deliberate arrangement that suggested careful positioning rather than natural placement. His axe, which he had carried for clearing brush and marking trees, stood upright in the soil near his right shoulder, the blade driven deep into the earth as though planted intentionally. Around his body, the underbrush had been pressed completely flat, forming a perfect circle roughly 15 feet in diameter. The flattened vegetation showed no pattern consistent with an animal bedding down or a struggle taking place. It was simply compressed uniformly, as if enormous weight had been distributed evenly across the entire area. Enormous footprints surrounded the clearing, pressed deep into the soft forest floor. The prints were far larger than any human foot, measuring nearly 18 inches in length, with clear impressions of individual toes. They approached the clearing from multiple directions, converging on the spot where Eli lay. Most disturbing was the absence of any prints leading away from the scene. The tracks simply stopped at the edge of the flattened circle, as though whatever had made them had either vanished or had never left. Branches throughout the clearing and along the trail leading to it showed unusual damage. Some were scraped clean of bark at heights exceeding 8 feet, while others hung low and bent, as if something massive had leaned against them or pushed them aside while moving through the area. Several branches appeared to have been deliberately twisted rather than broken. The wood spiraled in ways that required sustained pressure rather than sudden force. The forest surrounding the clearing was unnaturally silent. The search party noted the complete absence of birdsong, insect noise, or any of the typical sounds associated with healthy woodland. Even the wind seemed to avoid the hollow, leaving the air stagnant and heavy. Several members of the search party later reported feeling intensely watched during the entire time they spent at the scene, as though unseen eyes were tracking their every movement from the dense forest beyond the clearing. Eli's face was frozen in an expression of absolute terror, his eyes wide and his mouth slightly open. A medical examination conducted later found no injuries, no signs of physical trauma, and no obvious cause of death. His heart had simply stopped, and the coroner eventually ruled the death as cardiac arrest of undetermined origin. Toxicology screens came back negative for drugs, alcohol, or any known poisons. His clothing was intact and showed no tears, stains, or other evidence of struggle. The official report classified the incident as an accidental death occurring during routine forestry work, attributing the cardiac arrest to possible underlying health conditions that had gone undiagnosed. The unusual circumstances at the scene, the arranged boots, the planted axe, the flattened vegetation, and the enormous footprints were noted but not explained. The logging company quietly avoided sending workers back to that particular section of forest, and the service trail was eventually removed from operational maps. Those who had been present at the clearing refused to return to the area. Several requested transfers to logging operations in different regions, while others left the industry entirely. They spoke privately about the oppressive atmosphere of the hollow and the persistent sensation that something had remained present, even after Eli's body was removed, watching from the shadows and waiting with patient malevolence for the next intrusion into its territory. The Black Forest of southwestern Germany had accumulated centuries of folklore and legend, its dense woodlands inspiring tales of witches, spirits, and creatures that existed somewhere between myth and memory. The forest itself covered nearly 5,000 square miles of mountainous terrain, characterized by steep ridges, narrow valleys, and stands of pine and spruce so thick that hikers could easily lose their way within minutes of leaving marked trails. Human settlement in the region dated back to Roman times, with successive waves of habitation leaving behind ruins, forgotten paths, and areas that locals instinctively avoided without being able to articulate precisely why. By the 21st century, the forest had become popular with tourists and outdoor enthusiasts, though experienced hikers knew that certain remote sections retained an atmosphere of genuine wilderness. where modern amenities and safety measures ceased to exist. On September 3, 2024, two solo hikers, Aaron Brandt and Lily Norwell, independently chose to camp along a remote ridge system deep within a particularly isolated section of the forest. Neither knew the other was there. They had simply selected sites approximately half a mile apart, based on topographical features that promised good views and flat ground for pitching tents. The ridge itself rose sharply from the surrounding valleys, its spine narrow enough in places that a person could see down both slopes simultaneously. Ancient pines clung to the rocky soil, their roots exposed where erosion had stripped away the thin layer of earth. The nearest village lay over 12 miles to the west, and the hiking trail that had brought both campers to the ridge was unofficial, marked only by occasional cairns left by previous travelers. Aaron Brandt was a 31-year-old software engineer from Munich who had taken a week's vacation specifically to challenge himself with a solo wilderness trek. He was moderately experienced, having completed several multi-day hikes in the Alps and the Pyrenees, though he had never ventured into this particular section of the Black Forest. He had pitched his tent on the eastern end of the ridge, selecting a small plateau that offered protection from wind and a clear view of the sunrise. Lily Norwell was a 28-year-old botanist from Freiburg who frequently conducted fieldwork in remote forest environments. She was significantly more experienced than Aaron, comfortable with extended solo trips, and knowledgeable about the flora, fauna, and geography of the region. She had chosen a campsite on the western end of the ridge, drawn by the presence of several rare plant species she wanted to photograph and document. Aaron rose at dawn on his second morning and decided to hike westward along the ridge to scout the terrain for the day ahead. The morning was cold and overcast, with mist clinging to the valleys below and reducing visibility to perhaps 50 yards in any direction. He followed the ridgeline carefully, using his compass to maintain his bearing and occasionally stopping to mark his route with small piles of stones. After roughly 30 minutes of hiking, he emerged into a small clearing and immediately noticed a tent pitched near a cluster of rocks. He called out a greeting, assuming he would meet a fellow hiker, but received no response. As he approached, he saw that the tent's entrance was fully unzipped and hanging open, the interior visible and clearly empty. Lily's sleeping bag lay partially unrolled inside, and her backpack rested against the tent's rear wall, apparently untouched. What captured Aaron's attention, however, were the tracks surrounding the tent. Enormous footprints were pressed deep into the soft earth and patches of moss, each one measuring well over a foot in length and showing clear impressions of individual toes. The shape was humanoid, but grotesquely oversized, and the stride length between prints suggested something far taller than any normal human. The prints circled the tent multiple times before leading off into the dense forest to the north, following a line so straight it seemed almost deliberate. Aaron felt his pulse quicken as he examined the scene. He called out again, louder this time, asking if anyone was nearby. The forest absorbed his voice without returning even a normal echo. He waited several minutes, then made the decision to return to his own campsite to retrieve his gear and possibly hike down to alert authorities. When he reached his tent 25 minutes later, he found his campsite had been altered. His cooking equipment, a small portable stove, a pot, a pan, and utensils, had been removed from where he had stored them in his tent's vestibule and arranged in a careful pyramid shape about 10 feet away. His hiking boots, which he had left outside the tent to air out, were positioned heel to toe in a perfectly straight line pointing directly into the forest. The line extended from his tent toward the dense trees, as if indicating a direction he was meant to follow. Aaron stood frozen, trying to process what he was seeing. He had been gone less than an hour, and nothing he had witnessed could explain this level of precise manipulation of his belongings. He quickly packed his essential gear, hands shaking slightly as he worked, and prepared to descend the ridge immediately. Before leaving, he attempted to call out for Lily Norwell again, shouting her name across the ridge and into the valleys below. The echoes that returned were wrong. His voice came back to him warped and delayed, the syllables separated and repeated at intervals that did not match the geography of the area. At one point, he heard what sounded like his own voice calling Lily's name from a direction he had not shouted toward, as though something was mimicking the sound and throwing it back from an impossible angle. He stopped shouting and listened to the forest, which had fallen into an unnatural silence devoid of wind, birds, or the rustle of small animals in the undergrowth. That night, forced by failing light and exhaustion to camp one final time before completing his descent, Aaron pitched his tent in a small depression that offered some cover. He did not light a fire and ate a cold meal from his provisions. Around midnight, he was awakened by breathing, heavy, rasping inhalations and exhalations that circled his tent slowly, pausing periodically as if the breather was examining the tent from different angles. Then came the tapping, slow, deliberate strikes against the tent canvas, each one measured and spaced evenly. The tapping moved around the tent's perimeter for nearly 15 minutes before stopping abruptly. Aaron did not sleep for the remainder of the night. At first light, he abandoned most of his gear and fled down the mountainside, moving as quickly as the steep terrain would allow. As he descended, he became aware of a presence behind him, not following exactly, but observing his retreat. He heard a single deep exhalation, a breath not his own, coming from somewhere upslope. Then the forest fell completely silent, and he knew with absolute certainty that whatever had been watching him had decided to let him go. When Aaron reached the village and reported what he had found, a search party was dispatched to locate Lily Norwell. They found her tent and equipment exactly as Aaron had described, along with the enormous footprints and the trail leading into the forest. Despite 3 days of intensive searching, covering an area of several square miles, no trace of Lily Norwell was ever discovered. The official report concluded that she had likely become disoriented and lost in the dense forest, though it could not account for the footprints or the bizarre arrangements found at both campsites. Aaron Brandt never returned to the Black Forest and avoided wilderness hiking for years afterward, unable to shake the memory of those warped echoes and the sensation of being observed by something that existed just beyond the edge of human perception.